Down in the mud, 300 men were bleeding out, leaving the hiss of rain on hot rifle barrels as the only sound. Nora didn't even flinch when an ejected brass casing burned a half-moon into her cheek. So much for them telling her she didn't have the stomach. The smell of the hide was the first thing that broke you down. It wasn't the romanticized scent of danger or the clean metallic tang of weaponry. It was ammonia. It was the sharp, sour reek of Nora's own stale urine in the plastic bottles tucked into the corner, mixed with the damp, rotting smell of the wet wool blanket she'd been lying on for 72 hours. Nora shifted her weight by a fraction of an inch. A sharp cramp seized her left calf, twisting the muscle into a knot that burned like a lit match under her skin. She didn't massage it. She didn't move. She just let the pain wash over her, gritting her teeth until the grit of fine, blown plaster crunched between her molars. She was tucked inside the hollowed-out ventilation space of a ruined cement factory, overlooking a valley road that snaked through the jagged foothills of the northern border. To the naked eye, from the ground, the vent was just another black void in a building full of them. Inside, it was a coffin. "You're too soft for this, Campbell," Chief Petty Officer Wells had told her, standing under the harsh fluorescence of the armory back at Coronado. He had been looking at her evaluation sheets like they were printed on toilet paper. "Your grouping is flawless, sure. But you hesitate. You look at the targets like you're trying to figure out what they had for breakfast. A seal doesn't ask questions. A seal doesn't care. You're a stray dog in a wolf pack." Nora blinked the memory away, focusing her right eye through the Schmidt and Bender scope mounted on her. 338 Lapua Magnum. She wasn't a wolf. She knew that. Wolves killed for dominance. Wolves killed because it was in their nature. Nora killed because she was a mathematician of violence, and the math was currently heavily weighed against the men of Echo Platoon, who were pinned down 3 miles to the south. She pressed her cheek back against the stock. The composite material was slick with her own cold sweat. Her spotter, Miller, was supposed to be here. He had caught a piece of shrapnel to the femur during the insertion hike. She had to tourniquet his leg, hide him in a culvert with a distress beacon, and climb the tower alone. Without Miller, she had to do her own wind calls. She had to watch her own six. She had to carry the extra ammunition. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Through the optics, the valley road was empty, painted in the bruised, purple light of false dawn. Then, she felt it. Before she heard the engines, she felt the low-frequency vibration vibrating through the cold concrete against her breastbone. It was a deep, rhythmic thrum. She adjusted the magnification. They were coming around the bend. It wasn't just a patrol. It was a motorized infantry column. 5 armored personnel carriers, drab olive and scarred with rust, leading a convoy of flatbed trucks packed tightly with men. The Legion, a mechanized mercenary battalion that had been systematically executing prisoners across the province. Intelligence had estimated a strength of maybe 40 men in this sector. Intelligence was wrong. Nora counted the vehicles. She counted the silhouettes swaying in the back of the trucks. 100, 200, maybe 3. They were packed in like cattle, confident, smoking, rifles slung casually. They thought the valley was secure. They thought the air cover was grounded by the incoming storm front, which it was. They thought they had a clear run to flank Echo Platoon and wipe them off the map. Nora swallowed. Her throat was sandpaper. She reached down, her fingers moving blindly, and unscrewed the cap of her canteen. She took a sip just enough to wet her tongue and tasted the warm, plastic-flavored water. She wasn't a machine. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird flutter. A wave of profound nausea rolled through her stomach. She hated this. She hated the weight of the rifle. She hated the way the crosshairs bisected a human chest. She had a degree in biology. She knew exactly what happened when 250 grains of solid copper hit a human sternum at 3,000 feet per second. She knew how the bone fragmented. She knew how the lungs collapsed. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Too soft. The words echoed again. Maybe she was. She didn't want to kill them. She didn't hate the men in those trucks. She didn't know them. But she knew the 22 men in Echo Platoon. She knew that Lieutenant Davis had a newborn daughter he hadn't met. She knew that Doc Gallagher sent half his paycheck to his mother. Nora opened her eyes. The nausea receded, replaced by a cold, leaden calm. It wasn't bravery. It was a terrible, crushing resignation. She reached up and dialed the elevation turret on her scope. Click, click, click. The metallic sounds were loud in the confined space of the vent. She checked the crude wind indicators she had tied to the scrub brush along the road, small strips of torn fabric. The wind was blowing a gentle 3 miles per hour from the left. She settled the crosshairs on the driver of the lead APC. He was driving with the hatch open, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The vehicle was about to enter the narrowest part of the gorge, where the rock walls rose sheer and unclimbable on both sides. Distance. 840 meters, Nora whispered to herself, her voice cracking in the dry air. Hold, left, 1/2 mil. Her finger settled on the trigger. It was a 2-stage trigger. She took up the slack. The tension rested against the pad of her index finger. She exhaled, letting all the air leave her lungs. In the pause between heartbeats, where the world goes perfectly still, Nora pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, violently bucking backward. The recoil punched Nora in the collarbone, a dull, familiar brutality. A cloud of fine dust billowed out from the concrete ceiling above her, dusting her scope. She didn't watch the round hit. She was already cycling the bolt. Up, back, forward, down. The hot brass casing ejected, clinking against the concrete wall and rolling against her hip. Down in the valley, the driver of the lead APC ceased to exist as a conscious entity. The heavy bullet shattered his skull, dropping his lifeless body heavily onto the steering column. The armored vehicle lurched violently to the right, crashing into the rock wall with a horrific screech of tearing metal. It stalled out, completely blocking the narrow passage. The column ground to a halt. Brakes shrieked. Voices began to shout, distant and confused. Nora didn't pause. She shifted her hips, moving the muzzle slightly to the right, targeting the rear of the convoy. The last vehicle was a heavy fuel truck. The driver was leaning out of the window, trying to see what the holdup was. Nora settled the crosshairs on his chest. Exhale. Squeeze. The rifle kicked. The driver slumped over the doorframe. The truck idled helplessly. The trap was sprung. The Legion was boxed in. The lead was blocked by the wrecked APC. The rear was plugged by the deadweight of the fuel truck. 300 men were trapped in a kill zone barely 400 meters long. Now the math changes, Nora thought, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Now it's just work. Down below, the confusion turned into sudden, violent panic. The mercenaries began piling out of the trucks. Some were shouting orders. Most were just trying to find cover. But there was no cover. The road was a flat ribbon of dirt flanked by sheer rock. Nora loaded a fresh 5-round magazine. She slapped it home. She found a man in an officer's cap, waving a radio. Breathe out. Squeeze. The man's chest exploded outward in a pink mist. He fell backward, the radio skittering across the dirt. She cycled the bolt, found a gunner trying to mount a heavy machine gun on the roof of a flatbed. Squeeze. The gunner dropped before he even touched the weapon. Too soft. A tear tracked through the dirt on her cheek. She wasn't crying out of sorrow. She was crying because the continuous, concussive blasts of the muzzle brake were punishing her sinuses, forcing water from her tear ducts. Her right shoulder was rapidly turning black and blue under her shirt. Every time she pulled the trigger, it felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. Down in the gorge, it was a slaughterhouse. The mercenaries were returning fire now, but they had no idea where the shots were coming from. They were firing wildly into the hillsides, spraying the rocks with useless lead. Tracers bounced harmlessly off the cliffs, tracing angry red lines against the dawn sky. Nora kept shooting. She didn't pick the easiest targets. She picked the ones trying to organize. Anyone who stood up, anyone who pointed, anyone who moved toward the heavy weapons. Bolt back, brass out, bolt forward. Her rifle barrel was getting dangerously hot. She could see the mirage, the heat waves rising from the steel, distorting her sight picture. She had to fire through the distortion. She saw a young man down there. He couldn't have been more than 18. He had dropped his rifle and was trying to claw his way up the sheer rock face, his fingers bloody, screaming something she couldn't hear. Nora's finger hesitated on the trigger. Her stomach lurched. The kid was terrified. He was just a boy who had likely been handed a gun and a paycheck. You look at them like they're people. The boy lost his grip and slid back down to the road. As he landed, another mercenary grabbed him by the webbing, shoved him behind the tire of a truck, and started setting up a mortar tube right next to him. Nora swallowed the bile rising in her throat. If they got that mortar operational, they could saturate the hills. They might hit her. They might hit Miller down in the culvert. She didn't shoot the kid. She shot the man with the mortar tube. The round took him in the base of the neck. He collapsed heavily onto the boy. Nora dry heaved, her mouth tasting of copper and stomach acid. She kept her eye pressed to the scope. She forced herself to watch the boy crawl out from under the dead man, completely paralyzed by shock, curling into a fetal position against the tire. She left him there. 32, she whispered, her voice raspy, keeping count of the rounds she had fired. The noise down in the valley was a cacophony of overlapping screams, the metallic pinging of stray bullets hitting armor, and the roar of revving engines as panicked drivers tried to push past the wrecks, only making the barricades tighter. Nora reached for her third magazine. Her hands were starting to shake. The fine motor skills were degrading due to the massive dump of adrenaline and the physical trauma of the recoil. She fumbled the magazine, the heavy piece of metal slipping from her sweaty fingers and clattering against the concrete floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the hide. She froze. Had they heard it over the chaos? She stared through the vent. A group of mercenaries had gathered behind the engine block of the third truck. One of them, a man with a scarred face holding a pair of binoculars, was scanning the ridge lines. His gaze swept over the factory. Then, the binoculars stopped. He was looking directly at her hide. Nora slowly picked up the dropped magazine. She clicked it into the mag well. She didn't look through the scope. She looked over the top of it. The man with the binoculars lowered them. He pointed a finger straight up at the ruined cement factory. He opened his mouth to yell to the men around him. Nora slammed the bolt forward. She dropped her eye to the optic. She didn't check the wind. She didn't settle her breathing. She relied on the pure muscle memory instinct that Wells had insisted she didn't possess. She pulled the trigger. The man's head snapped back, his cap flying into the air. But it was too late. He had pointed. They knew where the Reaper was hiding. Suddenly, the disorganized spray of fire in the valley stopped. The remaining mercenaries, at least 200 of them, turned their weapons as one. The heavy machine guns, the assault rifles, the remaining mounted turrets. They all rotated, pointing upward, pointing at the concrete vent. Nora felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone against her belly. They see me. She grabbed 2 spare magazines, shoving them into the dump pouch on her chest rig. She couldn't stay here. The concrete was thick, but it wouldn't withstand concentrated fire from heavy caliber weapons. Before she could even drag her rifle back from the firing port, the world outside her vent erupted in fire. The world dissolved into gray powder and deafening noise. The incoming fire didn't sound like the sharp cracks of a rifle range. It sounded like a massive, continuous tear in the fabric of the air, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic thud of 50 caliber rounds chewing into the factory's exterior. The concrete wall of Nora's hide, built to withstand industrial wear, began to disintegrate under the sheer volume of lead. Fist-sized chunks of aggregate exploded inward. One grazed her helmet, snapping her head back so violently she bit her tongue. Warm copper flooded her mouth. She didn't execute a tactical withdrawal. She scrambled backward like a trapped rat, her boots slipping on the slick shell casings rolling beneath her. Panic, cold and absolute, spiked through her nervous system. She slammed her shoulder against the back wall of the vent, gasping, swallowing a mouthful of thick, choking plaster dust. Too soft. She grabbed the heavy barrel of the Lapua to drag it back, and the searing heat burned straight through her tactical glove, blistering her palm. She hissed, dropping it, then grabbed the sling instead, yanking the weapon toward her chest. The front of the vent was gone, replaced by a jagged hole, pouring in gray morning light and angry yellow traces. The noise was absolute. It pressed on her eardrums until they felt like they were bleeding. She rolled onto her stomach and began to low-crawl down the length of the ventilation shaft, moving away from the firing port. The shaft was narrow, rusted iron gratings scraping against her chest rig. She left the heavy spotting scope. She left the half-empty canteens. She only dragged the rifle and the spare magazines bumping heavily in her dump pouch. Spiders and decades-old filth rained down on her face. A stray bullet punched through the ductwork 2 feet behind her heel, ripping a jagged tear in the metal. The shriek of tearing tin echoed loudly in the confined space. Nora squeezed her eyes shut and crawled faster, her elbows bleeding through her uniform shirt. She reached the grate that dumped out onto the factory's interior catwalks. She didn't unscrew it. She kicked it violently with her heavy combat boot. It gave way on the second strike, clattering down 50 feet into the darkness of the main factory floor. Nora wriggled out, her body hanging over the precipice for a terrifying second before she caught the rusted railing of the catwalk. She pulled herself over, collapsing onto the grated steel walkway. Her chest heaved, her lungs burned. She spit out a glob of bloody saliva and cement dust. Below her, the factory was a cavern of shadows and rusted machinery. Above her, the corrugated tin roof was full of holes. Through them, the sky was bruised and heavy. She looked at the metal stairs leading down to the ground floor. There was her exit. She could descend, slip out the back loading docks, and disappear into the scrubland. She had done her job. She had stalled the column. She had killed over 30 men. Nobody would blame her for breaking contact when an entire motorized battalion focused its firepower on her. Any sane sniper would displace and vanish. But if she vanished, the suppression on the valley floor would stop. The mercenaries would clear the wrecked vehicles. They would push through the gorge. In 20 minutes, they would stumble across Miller's culvert. In an hour, they would hit Echo Platoon's exposed flank. Nora stared at the stairs. Her legs were trembling. A deep, primal part of her brain was screaming at her to run, to live, to go home and never touch a rifle again. She wanted a hot shower. She wanted to sleep for a week. She cursed out loud. A harsh, broken sound in the empty factory. She pushed herself up from the catwalk. She didn't take the stairs down. She limped down the walkway toward the southern end of the building, toward the towering cement silos. Her left calf was cramping again, a brutal, seizing pain, but she ignored it. She found a shattered, floor-to-ceiling window on the 3rd level of a storage outbuilding, overlooking the bend in the gorge from a completely different angle. It was terrible cover. Just rusted I-beams and broken glass. No concealment, but it had a clear line of sight to the wreckage blocking the road. Nora threw herself down onto the concrete lip of the window. The floor was littered with shards of glass that bit into her knees. Rain began to fall, fat, cold drops blowing through the broken window, chilling the sweat on her neck. She deployed the bipod on the Lapua. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely manipulate the legs. She took a deep breath, trying to force the adrenaline down, trying to find the cold mathematician inside her head. She pressed her eye to the scope. The lens was cracked on the outer edge from a piece of flying concrete, but the center crosshairs were clear. Down in the valley, the Legion had stopped firing at her old hide. They were cautiously moving out from behind the trucks, looking up at the ruined vent. A squad of them was jogging toward the wrecked APC, carrying heavy tow chains. They were going to clear the block. Distance: 900 meters, Nora estimated. Wind: she felt the wet breeze on her face. Crosswind: full value. Hold right, 1 mil. She settled the crosshairs on the man holding the heavy steel hook of the tow chain. Her shoulder screamed in anticipation of the recoil. She didn't hesitate. She didn't let herself think about the man's life, his family, or his reasons for being there. She just did the math. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, echoing massively in the cavernous room. The man with the hook dropped like a stone, the heavy chain falling across his chest. Down in the valley, heads snapped toward her new position. The panic returned. The Reaper wasn't dead. Nora cycled the bolt. Brass flew. She found the second man grabbing for the chain. Squeeze. He fell. The battle devolved into an ugly, grinding stalemate of attrition. Nora didn't have a hide anymore. She had a desperate firing position. The mercenaries figured out her new angle quickly. The sheer volume of fire they poured toward the outbuilding was terrifying. Bullets spalled against the I-beams, sending razor-sharp flakes of rusted steel flying through the air. One of those flakes caught Nora above her left eyebrow. She didn't even feel it hit. She just suddenly felt the hot, sticky flow of blood running down into her eye, stinging fiercely. She wiped it away with the back of her dirty glove, smearing crimson across her vision, but it kept flowing. She fired again. The recoil pushed her back. Her right shoulder felt like it was separated. Every time she pulled the trigger, a sharp, stabbing pain shot down her arm to her fingertips. Bolt back. Bolt forward. She was running low on ammunition. She had brought 100 rounds. She was down to her last 20. Down below, the Legion was getting desperate. They realized they were trapped in a shooting gallery, and the only way out was forward. A group of about 20 men decided to make a run for it, abandoning the trucks and sprinting along the narrow ditch beside the road, trying to slip past the wrecked APC. Nora's breathing was ragged. She couldn't pick them off, one by one, not at a sprint. She had to break their momentum. She aimed for the man in the lead. He was running fast, head down. Squeeze. The shot hit him in the thigh, severing his femoral artery. He pitched forward into the dirt, screaming, thrashing violently. The men behind him tripped over him, piling up in the narrow ditch. Nora worked the bolt with frantic, uncalculated speed. She didn't focus on breathing or trigger control. She just fired into the tangle of bodies. Boom, clack, boom, clack, boom. She emptied a 5-round magazine in less than 6 seconds. The heavy, 338 rounds tore through limbs and torso armor indiscriminately. The ditch became a butcher's yard. The survivors of the sprint scrambled backward, abandoning their wounded, clawing their way back behind the safety of the truck tires. Nora dropped the empty magazine. Her thumb fumbled the release catch. She grabbed her second-to-last mag. Suddenly, a massive, concussive wave slammed into the building. The sound followed a fraction of a second later, a deafening explosion that shook the concrete under her chest. They had gotten a mortar tube operational. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. A chunk of masonry slammed into Nora's back, driving the breath from her lungs. She gasped, arching her spine, seeing black spots dance across her vision. "Get up," a voice commanded in her head. It didn't sound like Chief Wells. It sounded like her own voice, flat and exhausted. She forced herself back to the scope. The world tilted sideways for a moment before stabilizing. Through the optics, she saw the mortar crew. They were set up behind the fuel truck at the rear of the column, hastily dropping another shell into the tube. Nora aimed at the man holding the shell, but the angle was bad. The truck's bulk shielded most of his body. She shifted her crosshairs. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the fuel truck. It was a massive, cylindrical tanker, painted desert tan. "Armor-piercing incendiary," she prayed, hoping she had loaded her mixed magazine. She aimed at the center mass of the tank, right below the painted hazard symbols. She exhaled. She pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the tank. For a hot beat, nothing happened, just a tiny black hole in the metal. Then, the valley ignited. The fuel vaporized and caught, resulting in a colossal fireball that bloomed outward in a terrifying sphere of orange and black. The shockwave visibly rippled through the humid air, hitting the factory a second later, blowing the rest of the glass out of the window frame and throwing Nora backward onto the floor. She lay there, her ears ringing with a high, continuous pitch that drowned out all other sound. The air smelled of burnt hair, diesel, and pulverized rock. She couldn't hear the screams down below, but she knew they were there. The rear half of the convoy was engulfed in an inferno. Nora slowly, painfully rolled onto her side. Every muscle in her body protested. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in concrete dust, blood, and the black carbon fouling of her rifle. They were trembling uncontrollably. She didn't crawl back to the window. It was over. The math had finally zeroed out. The Legion was broken. She lay on the cold concrete for a long time, watching the rain fall through the shattered ceiling, letting the freezing water wash the blood out of her left eye. Nora finally sat up. She unclipped her helmet, letting it drop to the floor. She unslung her rifle, treating it with a sudden, profound revulsion. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to look at it. She gathered her remaining gear slowly, methodically. She found her medical kit and slapped a crude pressure dressing over the gash on her forehead, wincing as the adhesive pulled at her skin. She walked down the metal stairs, her legs feeling like lead weights. The factory was silent now, save for the dripping rain and the distant, muffled thud of airstrikes, finishing off whatever was left of the mercenaries in the gorge. She walked out the back of the factory, stepping into the wet scrubland. The cold air hit her, sharp and clean, cutting through the smells of the hide and the cordite. She had to walk 3 miles back to the culvert where she had left Miller. Every step was agony. Her bruised shoulder throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel like a warrior who had just single-handedly crippled a mercenary battalion. She remembered the kid scrambling up the rocks. She remembered the man trying to attach the tow hook. "Too soft," she muttered to the empty hills, her voice cracking. When she finally reached the culvert, the sun was fully up, casting harsh, unforgiving light across the rocky terrain. Miller was awake. He was pale, his lips blue, clutching his rifle across his chest. But he was alive. The tourniquet on his leg was holding. He looked up at her as she slid down the embankment. He took in the blood on her face, the ripped uniform, the hollow, haunted look in her eyes. "You look like hell, Campbell," he rasped, forcing a weak smile. "Here, you had a busy morning." Nora sat down heavily in the mud beside him. She dropped the heavy Lapua rifle onto the rocks. It clattered loudly, a dead piece of metal. She looked down at her bloody, blistered hands. She had killed over 50 men today. She had burned others alive. She had saved Echo Platoon. She didn't smile back at Miller. She just leaned her head back against the damp concrete of the culvert, closed her eyes, and waited for the medevac helicopters. "Yeah," Nora whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind. "Just did the math.